Welcome to Dr. Roger and Friends, the bright side of longevity, hosted by three Ps in a podcast, Doc Roger, Teresa, and Danielle. Thanks for joining us for Coffee and Conversation. You know Teresa Beshwate is a co-host for Doc Roger and Friends, but you might not know that she's a certified professional coach who helps widow people reconstruct after loss so they can hurt less, live more, and actually love life again. She holds a master's in public health and is a longtime member of the Masterpiece Living team.
Well, hello everybody, and hope you're all well out there. Welcome to the bright side of longevity. And you know, this COVID thing has us all being, reminded how important people are to us, how important relationships are, and whether it's because we don't have close relationships, at least physical right now, or because we are locked in with people who are driving us crazy, and or not. And so I guess we're just being reminded. And so relationships are very important, and we know they're very important to be healthy, to be balanced, and for a bright longevity. But as I've already alluded to, people are really messy. So that's really a challenge. You know? Someone once defined expert to me as someone from out of town. And so when we wanted to get relationship expertise, you know, naturally we put our eyes on the horizon, and sitting right next to us is our expert. So Teresa, you're on tap today. I guess you literally are out of town, but not as far as we're concerned. You're always sitting right next to us and on the team. But we appreciate you doing this. Because this is not easy. I mean, just take the first question I'm going to ask you. I could never answer this question. I would struggle with this question forever. And that is, how would you define relationships?
Well, I do it pretty differently than most people based on my training, Roger. And it boils down to what we think about another person. And here's an example. You might really dislike the person who's my best friend, but I adore her. She's the same person. You and I have different thoughts about her. Or here's an example, a different example. One employee loves their boss and another employee cannot stand that very same boss. You know, and how can that be? And if it's because of our thoughts about the boss. Our thoughts are different.
Preconceived notions of who that person should be. Is that it?
Should be, yes. Yeah. Now, and we might say our thoughts about this person depend on them and what they do and how they behave, but that's really not quite the root cause of it. This is it. Our thoughts about another person are dependent on our expectations of them and how well they meet those expectations. And I know we've talked about expectations before on the podcast. So this notion of I'm going to treat you according to how you treat me, I think is all wrong. And I think it's wrong because it gives away all the power to the other person. So essentially, you know, we become a victim of whatever mood someone else is in today. The power is in saying, no matter how you behave today, I'm going to think my own thoughts about you. That keeps me, you know, in total control instead of being completely disempowered. I have a great boss, though, so it doesn't apply to me.
I do as well. Aren't we so lucky?
Yeah, well, okay. Thank you very much. And so my expectations of people I work with is that they love me, you know, so there you go.
And we do.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And it goes both ways. I can't tell you how much I enjoy doing this podcast with you two. I learn every day, and I just learned a whole lot because in that short little few sentences that you said, you put everything in a totally different light, but that makes sense to me. but we didn't. This is so different than what we learn as we're growing up and when we're kids.
Oh my gosh, yes. We're taught as kids, like, you hurt that person's feelings, now apologize. So we're kind of taught that there's a direct correlation between what we did and how someone else feels, but there's actually kind of that protective layer in between. We can't directly hurt someone's feelings. They have thoughts that hurt, or when our feelings are hurt, it's because we have thoughts that are hurtful. Let me give you an example. I used to work with a nurse, really great woman, and we had a great relationship, but one day she was incredibly short with me, and it was kind of public, and other people noticed and they mentioned it to me. I didn't miss a beat. Do you know why? Because I knew what was going on with her. I knew that her mother-in-law was in the final stages of cancer, and I knew that my colleague blamed herself, thinking that she should have caught the early warning signs, and she didn't. So it was my thoughts about that situation that kept me 100% immune from being hurt. And in fact, nothing she could have said to me would have caused me hurt. I only felt sympathy for her, but that's because of my thoughts about her and her situation.
It's kind of like my grandmother used to say, you have to walk in someone's shoes for a mile to really understand what's going on and accordingly how you would respond to them. That's good advice.
Yeah, and I had the kind of the insight into knowing what was going on in her life, and other people didn't. But so often we don't have that insight about our colleagues, about the people in our lives. You know, so it is easy to have thoughts that lead to us feeling hurt. The tricky thing, I think, about relationships is that we think that we have to control the world, you know, in order to feel a certain way, and that other people need to behave in a certain way so that we can feel good. And from my training, that's defined as the manual, which is a rule book for how we think other people should behave. And what's interesting is that we have manuals for almost every person in our lives, our spouses, our boss, our friends, our family, and maybe a super thick one for our parents. So we have these detailed like manuals or rule books for how people should behave, but we never actually tell them about it. And yet we expect them to behave accordingly.
There's a line in, I think, one of Bobby Dylan's songs that said, I crossed the line that only you could see.
I love it. Well, it's
and I do that a lot every day.
Not in your work life. You always say, Roger, you know, give up the need to be right. And I love that. And I hear that replay in my head. And I also think that's kind of an analogy to burn your manuals. Have no expectations. Let the humans, or at least like the adults, be exactly who they are, and relinquish that idea of controlling them, because that's an illusion anyway. We cannot control the people, any of the people.
No. Wise indeed.
So interesting. And what about the notion of, if we can meet all of our own needs, if we are truly like emotional adults and we realize that our feelings are always our responsibility and never someone else's, you know, if we don't need another person to act in a certain way so that we get to feel a certain way, then we take all of our power back. We no longer need to control anybody. You know, it boils down to, you're an adult, you get to be who you are, and I get to decide what I think and feel about that. You know, if people can meet their own needs, then the time that is spent together is just bonus. It's good.
Boy, would that be powerful if we did teach our kids that way.
Oh, yeah.
About their expectations and their own responsibilities.
Well, I'm thinking about this, and I'm wondering about boundaries, because you'd mentioned, Roger, that invisible line that nobody else can see. You know, you're not aware is there, but we're crossing it. Can you talk a little bit about the physical and emotional boundaries? Are they necessary, and are they healthy?
Yeah, be good to define it, because I think we use that word when we really shouldn't. So it's easy to mix up a boundary versus a threat or a manipulation. So here's a definition. If someone's coming into your emotional or physical space in a way that's inappropriate, you need to set a boundary for yourself. A threat is what you want them to do. So you need to do this or else we can't be friends. Versus a boundary is what we will do. So here's the condition. If you say, yell at me again, then I will no longer be a part of this friendship. So you're still allowing that person to be who they are. If they want to yell, they can yell. You're not saying, don't yell at me again. You're saying, if you choose to do this again, then here's my choice. And that's created with love, and it always has to be, followed through on. So that's really the definition of boundaries. A boundary is not to say you need to take out the trash or else, because technically that isn't a violation of a person's emotional or physical space. It's kind of more of an ultimatum or trying to control. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does to me. And going back just one statement about love, I think there are a lot of people who think that if you love someone, there are no boundaries. And you're telling me, and I certainly have experience and totally agree that that's not true. And or they say you don't voice those boundaries, and that only leads to difficulty, I would say.
So many unhealthy relationships could be so much healthier with boundaries. Yeah.
So I'm curious, now that I have a definition of boundaries that I didn't have before, thank you. When you mentioned that sometimes people say things that hurt our feelings, so that's not an emotional boundary, that just is, we have a thought about what they've said and we feel hurt. So we can take responsibility for that. But in relationships with friendships with loved ones, is there as a coach, something you would offer to deal with if that's a repetitive behavior? Like maybe somebody, a close friend, is always saying those little backhanded compliments, and they might not even realize they're doing it, that hurt you, and you're taking responsibility, okay, this is how I feel. Is there a way to mend that fence?
I think, being courageous enough to have that conversation, because what you're describing doesn't sound like ultimately a healthy relationship or potentially not a long-term relationship anyway. So why not have the courage to say, when you say things like this, I have these thoughts which make me feel this way. I would like our relationship to continue. You're welcome to say anything you want to say, but just know that if you say that sort of nature of things, then I'm going to take this action. So you still get to be you. I'm just going to do this as a result, and then follow up. And that's a pretty loving, it has to come from a loving place.
Yeah. And finding out when to make those statements. You've offered some really good tips, because somebody can say something, as you mentioned with your friend who was going through something that nobody knew about, and she was short with you. You know her to be a loving person. You knew she was going through something. You're like, okay, I'm just going to let that go. And we can choose, if it's once in a while, somebody says something and well, this is a loving person. They probably didn't mean it that way, and let it go. But if it's a recurring thing, to know when you need to support yourself. And you're saying that is that setting a boundary, or is that not setting a boundary by your definition? Just for clarity.
I think that is setting a boundary. If a friendship is starting to, be difficult to be in, granted, yes, because of your own thoughts based on their actions or behaviors, still fine. You would want to set a boundary. And if there continues to be a boundary violation, then you've already stated what your action would be. And you still get to make that decision, but you make it from a place of emotional adulthood, knowing that your feelings are caused by your thoughts, knowing that a boundary was set lovingly, but then violated. And so you make that decision from that place versus a place of, I'm trying to control this person. They are refusing to be controlled. They will not meet my needs, and they're making me angry, right? So they have all the power in that situation. And what we're describing is you have all the power, you have all the choice, you made a calm decision from a place of love. And you still gave them choice too.